I am the Reverend JaQuan Beachem, and I serve as the Associate Dean at Andover Seminary at Yale Divinity School. And it is wonderful to see all of you here for this amazing occasion. Will you join me in a posture of prayer? God of the sunshine, thank you for shining and smiling upon us on today. We take a moment of Selah to take a breath in and out, knowing that you, O God, are closer to us than our breath. We inhale the joy of fellowship and exhale the peace of holy community as we connect through time and space in this present moment. Holy One, we gather to celebrate Reverend Dr. Mark Heim, your beloved child. And in celebrating Mark, one of your Gospels, we celebrate Melissa, their family, their loved ones, and all who are gathered here for this great occasion, and all who are connected to them through divine intervention on this earth. God of love and learning, we are grateful for the knowledge that has been passed through his scholarly legacy. We honor you for trusting him with crucified wisdoms that could push our conversations of learning forward. We praise you, O God, for the world-making of theological education in a broken world. An education that is like a balm, a sacred medicine which can mend broken hearts and grant peace of minds as we move into complexities of this world, live into our pluralities, and allow for the stranger to become neighbor around table. And God of light, we acknowledge the blessing of Mark's cloud of witnesses and our esteemed keynote and panelists, and again, all who have gathered here today to witness belovedly and listen in to what the divine is saying here and now. To the one who saves us from sacrifices and guides us on our paths while pointing us to life and life abundantly, we pray. Amen and Ashe.
Good afternoon. My name is Greg Sterling. I have the honor of serving as the dean of this school. And on behalf of the Divinity School and of Yale University as a whole, we extend a very warm welcome to each of you. There are some who've come from a great distance, and I see President Emeritus Nick Carter and his wife have come from southern Pennsylvania. We're grateful for your presence, Nick. I see David Smith and a whole group of other trustees of the past, those who are on the advisory council who've made the trek here, and to all of you who were students of Mark's or colleagues of Mark, we extend a very special welcome to you. I know that some of you thought that when this day came, you'd be on a different hill, one in Newton Center. But the longer that I live, the more convinced I am that Plato's summary of Heraclitus' statement about the cosmos and its flux applies to institutions and human beings. You never step into the same river twice. Or as I like to put it, God has a sense of humor, and things don't always work the way we think. But faculty are the heart of any institution. They are the draw for students to come to us. And your presence here today is an ample witness to the importance of faculty in an institution. We share your assessment of Mark Heim. When Andover Newton came to the Divinity School, the provost made a rather remarkable decision, at least remarkable from the standpoint of Yale's policies and protocols. There were two faculty, Mark and Greg, whom the provost said they wouldn't have to go through a formal tenure review. They could be visiting professors on renewable contracts for as long as they wanted, and they would have the full benefits of tenured faculty. Now, you may not appreciate that, but for Yale, that was quite a concession. And it wasn't really a concession, it was a recognition of the importance of both of those faculty members. As dean, I am deeply grateful to Mark and to Melissa for all of their contributions to this community in particular. And there's another concession that has been made. I'm very pleased to announce that with the contingent approval, it will be approved of the vote of the corporation, Mark will become Professor Emeritus at Yale. So to Mark and to Melissa, thank you for distinguished careers at Newton Center, and I say especially thank you for what you've done here in New Haven. Your appointment as emeritus is well earned, Mark. Thank you.
The Simpson-Hewett Lecture focuses on the topic of congregational history. It's an annual endowed lecture that we, Andover Newton, brought to New Haven from Newton Center. My name is Sarah Birmingham Drummond, and I serve Andover Newton Seminary with the title Founding Dean. And I am delighted to invite you to this Simpson-Hewett Lecture, which is dedicated to the scholarly legacy of S. Mark Heim. Puritans became pilgrims 400 years ago, and they were seeking religious freedom. Unironically, and at first not even trying, they established a state religion when they came to what we now call New England, and Congregationalism was that state religion. Arguably, nothing has changed the contours of Congregationalism more than religious pluralism. The rise of denominations and theological differences among them led to the founding of Andover Seminary, Yale Divinity School, and Newton Theological Institution in that order. And all three of those schools emerged during the Second Great Awakening, which was a result of traditions starting to bounce off each other and find that they needed to articulate the ways in which they were different from one another. Religious pluralism is part of Andover and Newton and Yale's history, going back to the earliest days of our three institutions' first partnerships in global missions, which have existed for 200 years. S. Mark Heim is what a scholar would call a field shaper in religious pluralism, and especially theology of religions and the comparative study of theologies. The three speakers, the three guests who will speak this evening, join Mark as the other field shapers, so we really hope they stay very safe, because without them, they're all four in one place. The proceedings of this Simpson-Hewett Lecture will be published in an upcoming issue of Foundations, which is a publication of the American Baptist Historical Society. Thank you to the executive director of the American Baptist Historical Society, Priscilla Eppinger, who's here with us this evening. This lecture is dedicated to Mark's scholarly legacy, but afterward we will have a reception where we'll further consider his teaching, citizenship, and ministry. And students from Andover Newton will be ready to show you the way to that reception in YDS's old common room and old refectory. These three field shapers in comparative theology are our keynote speaker, Francis X. Clooney, Society of Jesus, who serves as the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard University's Divinity School, HDS. You'll read a short bio of Frank's work in your program this evening, and we're all really eager to hear his thoughts and reflections. Thank you very much, Professor Clooney. Our respondents are Catherine Cornille from Boston College, also a professor of theology, and John Thatamanil, who's a professor of theology and world religions at Union Seminary. And again, you'll see more about them in our program. A way in which comparative theology or theology of religions is different from comparative religion is that comparative theology takes seriously that our faith grows deeper when we engage in dialogue with those of different faiths. And in this time, in this era, we're all starting to understand that how we can connect across differences in ways that enrich us rather than frighten us is a matter of life and death for our churches, for our society, for our world. Therefore, this topic, which we'll explore together, is so timely. And please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Francis X. Clooney, Society of Jesus.
Well, I'd like to begin by expressing my simple gratitude and delight to be here with Mark and Melissa, with Sarah and Jacob, with so many friends and family and colleagues of Mark over the years. It's an honor for me to be standing here now. I hope by the time I'm finished, you still think it's a good thing that I was standing here. So we hope. And I'd like to express my thanks to Dean Sterling and Dean Sarah Drummond for the welcome to be here also. And it's been a great occasion for me. And I was thinking back about the last 40 plus years. So I think I met Mark first in the fall of 1984. I was a freshly minted PhD, showed up to teach at Boston College, and I went to the Boston Theological Society meeting like in October of '84, and Mark was at the table, raised some penetrating questions about the paper that I was giving, and then afterwards Gabe Facker introduced you to me, and that's been happily ever after. So that's a long time now. And then being on committees in the joint doctoral program, Boston College, Andover, Newton over the years, we got to know each other in that way, and then theologically working together in different projects. Mark was kind enough to sit in on one of my courses before he went to Bangalore for the first time, and that was a great honor for me to have Mark in my classroom. So it's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and knowing that so many of you could have gotten up and be standing here instead of me. So many friends from Andover, Newton, so many people who know Mark from other institutions, and perhaps that's a stellar aspect of who Mark is, that he has intellectual colleagues who are also friends who can be intellectual colleagues as well, and the ability to have the penetrating, groundbreaking ideas and yet bring them together in a way that creates community as well. And I think that's a real testimony to Mark, and also interreligiously. So colleagues, for instance, at Boston College, John McCransky, a very important person in Mark's life, our professor of Tibetan Buddhism at BC for so many years. Anantanand Rambachan, a Hindu professor, one of the leading Hindu scholars in the United States, knowing Mark, discussing things with Mark, and being friends of Mark. And I think the rippling circles, maybe it'll be talked about in the teaching context, of other people at different temples, at other sites for religious reflection, also in different parts of India. Again, that personal touch, the latest kind of cutting-edge thinking, and also some faith meets faith across religious lines, and I think we celebrate that tonight. One of the things I did when Sarah contacted me about a year ago this time to invite me to be here tonight was to get all the books of Mark that I have in my shelf in my office off the shelf and go back and look at them again. And it's quite an impressive list, and I'm sure most of you know these books, so I won't spend time listing them all. But beginning with what I think is the first book, 1985, is Christ the Only Way. That book, which is a small book, but I found in preparing today a very important book, Salvations in 1997, Depths of the Riches, 2001, kind of that trilogy on thinking interreligiously about Christ in the context of the world religions. And then Saved from Sacrifice, the Theology of the Cross, that came out 2006. The grand and wonderful Crucified Wisdom, Theological Reflection on Christ and the Bodhisattva, 2018. 2022, Monotheism and Forgiveness. 2026, the newest book, which Mark was kind enough to send me the PDF back in the fall, Theology and Medicine in Conversation, How the Healing Happens, which he co-authored with Benjamin Doolittle of the Yale faculty, and a whole bunch of essays as well. So when you look at somebody and you realize that there is this great corpus, a curriculum vitae, which kind of leads you into running through the author's life and thinking with the author over time. What I'd like to communicate to you in the brief time that I have is something what I've learned of thinking about all these years that we've known each other, and also looking through these publications and finding things that I was not aware of and learning from them. I would say that, basic to Mark's career and writing is a faith-grounded thinking that is unafraid to cross religious borders. And both aspects are important. There are many scholars who can write about religions other than their own, but somebody so deeply rooted in their own faith tradition, unafraid, in fact, feeling obliged by their faith to learn interreligiously, is something Mark has done so well. And to do it not in a grand way, looking for the grand theory that explains everything, but to be able to take up projects, think about different aspects of Hinduism or Buddhism, let's say, in relationship to Christian tradition, and make it all come together for the moment before going on to something else and trying again and trying again. One of the perhaps good things about Mark being emeritus professor now is that he'll continue to think and continue to write and continue to teach, and there will be more over the next years to come forward. It's an ongoing dynamic, and I was asking myself, what's the motivation for this? How does this get started? And I did a little bit of detective work at the beginning, and I asked Mark about this. What was your dissertation about? And went back, and it's not the book on theology of religions, but it's an older piece, True Relations, D.C. McIntosh and the Evangelical Roots of Liberal Theology, 1982. Now, to tell you the truth, although I know McIntosh is a major figure here at Yale and was here at Yale most of his career, I understand there's a portrait of him somewhere that I'd love to see before leaving. A major figure who I had to learn about from Mark's work. And I think that the Evangelical Roots of Liberal Theology, and then some of Mark's first writings, a 1984 essay, a 1985 in the American Baptist Quarterly, The Path of a Liberal Pilgrim, a theological biography of Douglas Clyde McIntosh, an article in the Journal of Religion, 1985, Prodigal Sons, D.C. McIntosh and the Brothers Niebuhr, which is a story unto itself. So what about McIntosh? How does McIntosh affect Mark? And this is my fanciful thinking. You can tell me afterwards that I missed the point. But that somehow the effort to be a person of faith and facing up to the issues of the time, being responsible about American life, about ethics, about politics, about science, all of these things that McIntosh seemed to be standing for, you don't try them out and say, if it all works out, then I'll be a person of faith. No, you're a person of faith, and you engage, because that's part of your job, is to think across the boundaries. At the beginning of that first essay, 1984, Mark quotes, of all people, Karl Barth, one of our we're secret admirers of Karl Barth, secret no more, I guess. Barth says this about his mentors: those of us who knew some of them will know what I mean when I say that from many of these persons there emanated an unforgettable air of conscientiousness, of churchly and spontaneous piety, a peculiar combination of ethical earnestness and academic dignity. And that somehow I think that resonated with Mark, who in some ways exemplifies the same words. But the conscientiousness, churchly, spontaneous piety, and how that all came to kind of a dignified way of thinking out the academic world. And that McIntosh seemed to be standing for this. And he was known, to quote also from Mark's essay, his personal piety, his academic rigor united in a spirit which a German colleague called candida anima, a soul without guile. And for nearly half a century, Mackintosh stood as one of the fixed and luminous points in an American theological constellation marked by frequent disturbances and migrations. So even then, just as now, lots of turmoil and people moving around and so on. And so what I learned from Mackintosh, and I won't, because of the limit of my time, say too much about him, but that he was influential on Reinhold Niebuhr, H. Richard Niebuhr, J.S. Bixler, Roland Bainton, Robert Calhoun, Albert Outler, and others, and known, very well known a century ago for the problem of knowledge, theology as an empirical science, the problem of religious knowledge, and so on. One of the people who tried to make sure that theology was not afraid of realism, and that theology in the real world. And I think this is kind of a clue to how Mark himself has done his work over the years. Although I think Mackintosh, and Mark could correct me, doesn't appear a lot explicitly in later writings. I think there's kind of a sense there that if you understand who Mackintosh was, there in the beginning, arguing in all directions about faith and reason, observation, the empirical, you begin to get a sense of his work. Mackintosh himself writes, a theological autobiography, talking about himself, is of greatest value to others if it traces the course of the writer's religious faith and experience, as well as the effects of his thinking, of exposure to scientific fact, contemporary religious doubt, and philosophical speculation. And that I think Mark has done that extremely well with science, with health and medicine, and in particular with religions. In a way, we have to be able to expose our faith in all these different environments. So then the first of several parts I'd like to put forward is the trilogy, beginning with Is Christ the Only Way, 1985. And my thesis for this is that actually that little book, which is a less well-known than Salvations and the Depth of the Riches, actually has the core insight and start for the books that followed from it. In that book, Mark writes, if as Christians believe Christ represents the clearest knowledge of God, then we must say this God is not known save in the most fragmentary way in other faiths. Yet these fragments are true fragments. And this is very typical of Mark, I think. There's a fullness in Christ, and Mark never takes that back. And yet the fragments are not diminished or minor or unimportant. Those fragments are part of other religious wholes. For within those faiths, what we see as fragments are actually part of living wholes, distinct from the Christian confession. And the challenge of being a theologian is how the integral whole of a kind of convicted Christian faith meets and learns from other faiths, be it Buddhist or Hindu, Muslim or Jewish or other faiths, that this is really what we want to be able to say. In Christ, we get to know God, God's will in nature, above all, God's will toward us. We do not get to know all of what God knows or all of what God does. And that is why we should be unafraid of learning interreligiously. What does God know? What does God do? Look around you, and you'll begin to see that. Later in the book, Mark talks about, I think maybe one of his first mentions of Buddhism in a writing. The proper relationship of Christianity to other faiths is one of honest pluralism. The differences are real. One of the fundamental differences between Christianity and Buddhism, for example, has been expressed this way by a Buddhist. Buddhism declares that there is from the beginning no self to crucify. To think that there is a self is the start of all errors and evils. And I think that Mark could quote that in the book, and that's Koyama, quote that in the book without fear and without having to refute it, or without saying, well, you're right, I'm sorry, I was wrong all along. Is sort of saying, get it in front of your face, what other people say from their own faith perspectives. And I'd say that the dynamic of that small book follows up in Salvations as Mark kind of spreads a wider circle of trying to understand the different ways of salvation. There is no need for a Christian who believes everyone's saved through the cross of Christ to say that, but they're not saved by that, they're not saved by that. Like it or not, they're coming to the same place. Let people be and let people find the intrinsic dynamic of their own tradition. And in the Depth of the Riches, which is really the Trinitarian book of the three, I think Mark, again, continues to make this point. He says near the end of the book, The Depth of the Riches, 2001, at its heart, this book is a meditation on the Trinity. So most people reading it would say, no, this book is about world religions and about how to think about the religions together, which it certainly is. But it's a meditation on the Trinity. It asks how the Trinity helps us to understand the relationship between salvation and the religions. From another perspective, it asks how our study of salvation and the religions leads us to a more profound approach to the Trinity. So we learn from the Trinity out into the world, and from a dignified, deep, knowledgeable understanding of other traditions, we then come back and see the Trinity and the mystery of God in a new way. And that's so Mark, so Heim, I think. The result is always a new depth of the riches. Trinity, the religions, and salvation teach us about the plenitude of divine nature and divine purpose. So this is enough. So if Mark had stopped writing, after writing that book in 2001, Depth of the Riches, you could say, well, he will be remembered for his work in theology of religions, for thinking about the Trinity in the pluralistic context. But what's remarkable to me, and I think it makes sense if you begin to understand the dynamic of Mark back perhaps to his dissertation work, is that then he does something different. The next book, 2006, Saved from Sacrifice, is a book that barely mentions world religions at all. It's not a continuation of it, but Saved from Sacrifice, using the work of René Girard and others, to think about how to rethink what the cross is about, and how to get out of kind of, as Mark says, a kind of masochistic sense of suffering for its own sake, or the cross is kind of a weapon to threaten other people of other faiths, but rather, where is the power of the cross? And that this is something we need to understand. And it's not that he said, okay, I've done the religions thing, now move on. But having stepped out into religiously, then coming back and saying, now let me come back home again. The crossing over, crossing back, the pilgrim who goes, the pilgrim who returns. And in that book he says, in an empirical sense, the cross is both a wrench in the works of sacrifice and a spotlight on the practice of scapegoating. The most basic saving social respect of the cross, and I love this, the most saving social effect of the cross is to disrupt all our unanimities, sacrificial or apocalyptic. This disruption is a form of grace, even if by itself is not sufficient grace. I'd like to think in his very mild, calm, gentlemanly way, Mark is an incredibly disruptive thinker. Because in the world of religious studies and comparative religion, he's a Christian theologian. And in the Christian theological circles, perhaps sometimes saying, why is he so interested in Buddhism? What is this about? But that the disruption is really what the cross is about. And that somehow if you stand by the cross, in the shadow of the cross, at the foot of the cross, you too have this kind of mission to be a disruptive person. And that understanding that you can write about the religions and then write a book which barely mentions religions, they're part of the same kind of project, critical thinking across the boundaries. One could follow up if one had more time. 2017, Approaches to Atonement, how Girard changes the debate, which barely mentions religions at all. 2022, an interpretation, Their Cross Problem and Ours, Thoughts on the Aesthetic of the Crucifixion, barely mentions religions at all. But clearly, this is one person thinking, and Mark thinking this way, that way, and trying to make sense of all this. And I would say that this, being very fond of comparative theology myself, that really this is showing us how to do comparative theology, or one very good way of doing comparative theology, where it's not about answering all the questions, it's not about kind of coming up with a theory that explains things theologically, or even a doctrine of world religions, but it's about the ability to go and to come and to keep up the practice of being a person of faith in a multiplicity of religions over and over again. Not in the book, in a 2020 essay in the book Theology Without Walls, Jerry Martin's project, in an essay with a wonderful title, More Window Than Wall, Mark says, comparative theology is the best current concrete demonstration of the right learning and the best example of theology without walls and its expanding confessional perspective. So it's a way of showing us how to think inside, outside our traditions. It might be considered a bilateral theology without walls, a reading together of sources of two and more traditions, typically one from a home tradition and one from another tradition, in which one has some level of learning or participation. And I think this really helps me because it echoes with what I think of how I do my own work. A comparative theologian embraces their confessional location, seeking to enrich and expand the truth found there. So the point of learning interreligiously is not to look for more truth somewhere else only, but rather it helps us to understand the depth of our own truth, but you can't do that unless you go somewhere and come back. And I think Mark is totally right on in saying that. One passes over into immersion in the study of the other and returns with enriched perspectives to be shared in the home community. And this, I think, is a general contribution to method in comparative theology, but that dynamic of from one side to the other. In the article, another article that he writes about home, out of an AAR panel, what does it mean to be at home in the study of religion? Mark goes on to say, many come to comparative theology or theology without walls because they have an experience of illumination or transformation through the substance of an unfamiliar religion. And in some circles, this might be taboo. Either the scholar who says, we're not interested in your personal experience, we're interested in your contribution to the field. Or in some Christian theological circles, what do you mean experience in another religious tradition? How is this possible? But Mark says it's transformation in the substance of another religion. And then he says in a typically Markian, low-key way, I have not lacked such experiences, some of which have overflowed all the categories I had for receiving them. So there's another article you could write in your retirement, Mark. I have not lacked such experiences, some of which have overflowed the categories I had to receive them. So being surprised interreligiously, and in a very kind of concerted, attentive, undramatic way to say, I went looking for something, I found much more than I expected, and my basic categories are kind of blown out. They're upset, they're disrupted, as Mackintosh would have said 100 years before. Everything is happening new. And he adds and then says, but none of this has surpassed my experiences of illumination and transformation in the Christian life. And I think that's not just, if he was a Roman Catholic, I say, you only said that to not get in trouble with the Vatican. But Mark has more freedom than a Roman Catholic does. But I think that's basic, again. The disruption, the overflowing, what is radically new, has not surpassed or done away with the experiences of illumination and transformation in my own Christian life. And I think that's really beautiful. In fact, what he says, go on to say, what first set me on the interreligious path was glimpses and tastes of what I take to be the end that's sought in the Christian path. So finding glimpses, echoes, recognizable others of the Christian out there. And not just in general, but specifically in Buddhist practice, Buddhist meditation, Buddhist learning, or Hindu learning, finding in some way that Christ is actually really there. And to be able to say that with a certain integrity and authority as a Catholic. Some of these glimpses came through personal contact with models of the kind of Christian I wanted to be, and the kind of Christian community I wanted to belong to and be shaped by. A Christian community that is not afraid to have windows at least open. Yes, walls to hold the building up, but also windows open to be unafraid to learn interreligiously, I think is a key feature of Mark's work. I think, Sarah, in your introduction, you mentioned something about the image of the pilgrim and the pilgrim journey. So a person who travels not simply as a tourist or not simply for business reasons or not simply to see other places, but it's kind of a holy pilgrimage out from where one is to the other. At the end of that, again, Mackintosh essay from 1984, Mark writes, expressed in the way I've been talking, we can see that the underlying identity of Mackintosh's concern with those of the evangelicalism in which he was nurtured and has sought to maintain. That there's an underlying identity, and Mackintosh is writing this, he's writing that, he's arguing with this group, he's fighting with the Niebuhrs, his students, and so on and so on. But there's something underlying it that is evangelical in a very profound and open sense. And I think that underlying identity is something that Mark has been graced to keep with him over the years. He goes on to say, Mackintosh described his pilgrimage as one individual's progress from the old traditional orthodoxy toward a new untraditional orthodoxy of the Christian religion. And perhaps Mark is not only a comparative theologian of religions, but a speaker, a person presenting the new untraditional orthodoxy of the Christian religion. It is new, it really is orthodox, and it's untraditional. It disrupts things and opens them up. And he says what Mackintosh's pilgrimage illustrates is a manner in which the old evangelicalism itself contained the impetus for an untraditional orthodoxy. So not despite, but because of the evangelical, it pushes you to do something appropriate to the age in which we live. In his essay on Home, again, where he talks about himself, Mark says, I myself am on a moving Christian path of that sort. And I think he's echoing, without mentioning Mackintosh's name, back to Mackintosh, striving and hoping to become more deeply what Christian faith can make me. In that sense, I am always learning to be a little less at home as I am, and a little more at home in the less familiar but wider world. And I think that's, again, it's so Markian. I'm on the Christian path. I want to be more deeply a person of Christian faith. Therefore, I am trying to learn to be a little bit less at home as I am, a little bit more at home in the less familiar and wider world. And that seems to be so authentic and comes back again and again. I'm almost at the end. A Crucified Wisdom. So the book that is a splendid later in career, but certainly not the last great book from Mark's pen to come forward. The comparison of Christ and Bodhisattva, thinking about them together. This book, Mark says right at the beginning, and then throughout, it has a personal tone to it, has a kind of meditative practice to it. So by this point in his career, some years after the early trilogy, thinking about Buddhism and Hinduism, going to India for the first time, traveling for the first time, etc., in that part of the world, to be able to say, intrinsic to what I do is really the meditative practice, learning to meditate, talking not endlessly, but often to John McCransky about practice, joining meditation groups, and allowing his Christian faith to kind of flourish from the ground of meditation is so important. And thinking about, well, what does the Bodhisattva mean? And what do Bodhisattvas in Christ have in common? So selfless giving, generosity, compassion for the world. Some people would say, okay, that's it, end of story. But I think Mark is saying, no, if you go deeper and deeper, you realize that the Bodhisattva in Christ aren't the same, and yet they have a lot in common that makes us think about both of them differently. Although it comes later, in the Home in Three Dimensions essay from 23, Mark, I think, confesses really what would be part of the Crucified Wisdom book. He writes, days do go by, but very few, when I don't do one or more of the following. Study and reflect on scriptures and sources from religious traditions other than Christianity. Practice forms of meditation and reflection that I have learned from teachers and other traditions, participating in activities in those traditions, working closely in secular institutions with people from a variety of religious perspectives, and conversing and interacting with friends, family members, students, and colleagues from various religious traditions. So the 4 points there about the reflecting on the scriptures of other traditions, meditating according to practices of the other traditions, but then also not only in seminaries or religiously affiliated contexts, but in secular contexts as well, being able to speak to people who do the science, to people who do the medicine, and that somehow there's a contemplative grounding there that makes all these things open and be possible. At the end of Crucified Wisdom, Mark writes, we cannot all become the Christ. We cannot be who Christ was, historically, relationally, and vocationally. That means that we cannot fully be what Christ is, even in interpersonal location and effect, or in perfect identity. But we can share in all these things by participation in connection with Christ, God, and our neighbors. Being in Christ or having communion in Christ's body does not denote endless replication of a qualitatively indistinguishable situation, but it's an ongoing cumulative complexity of mutuality. And I think that is a sign of wisdom in age, that you realize when you get older, it's not as simple as you thought 40 years ago. Any of us could say this. But there's a way in which there's this cumulative complexity, and that somehow that's what God is like, that's what the world is like, that's what we need to be, and not to be afraid of that complexity. And he goes on to talk about, well, learning from the Bodhisattva tradition. But one of the things that I picked up on this, that he also, Mark, points out, many of the Buddhists don't think that Christ on the cross was a particularly bodhisattvic figure. There's too much suffering. There's too much, my God, why have you forsaken me? There's too much of you could say, an ego there. And these are friendly people. These are respectful people. But against any kind of casual sense that Christ and the Bodhisattva, have them both on your mantelpiece, they go together. But rather, when you go deep enough, and Mark has gone deep, very deep, to realize that you get unsettled at that deep depth, where you can no longer say easy things about Buddhism and Christianity, the Buddha and Christ, Bodhisattvas and Christ, because you realize that there are different opinions here. When I was writing a review of the book, Crucified Wisdom, for the Harvard Divinity Bulletin, Mark and I had an email exchange, and he allowed me to quote from it in the review, so I might as well quote from it tonight as well. So this is an email that Mark sent me. If wisdom, and of course the compassion implied by it, is at the heart of Buddhism, then crucified wisdom seems a shorthand for the way in which the crucifixion and Christian teaching on the cross come up short. That there's a certain sense from a certain Buddhist perspective, with all due respect, the compassion of the Christ is not really all the way there. Even to the gentle and generous Buddhist interpreters who want to make the most of Christ, it still comes up short. In the event of the cross, the authentic wisdom that can be found in Jesus is crucified, agitated, or disruptive in the suffering of this violent event. But too much suffering, too much violence, certain Buddhist perspectives say wonderful, impressive, but not quite what we do. And so Mark concludes in the email to me, so crucified wisdom is wisdom messed up. It represents taking seriously the truth of that perspective, the non-bodhisattva aspects of Christ. So Mark Heim, what did Mark Heim learn over 40 years of thinking about Buddhism? Christ is not a bodhisattva. And that can sound like, oh, come on. You could have said that in 1984, 85, and that would have been it. But rather, it's a brilliant insight to say at some point, I've been traveling, I've been meditating, I've been thinking across the boundaries, all of this, and at the end of it realizing the differences don't go away. And there's a way in which, again, being this disruptive, low-key, mild-mannered, disruptive professor, crucified wisdom is wisdom messed up. And that crucified wisdom is not simply this beautiful image of love on the cross, which it is, but it's also wisdom messed up. And I admire that greatly. Now, you would think Mark could just stop there and say, that book was the final piece, I have nothing more to say. And I'll just point this out briefly as I come to an end. In 2017 essay, Approaches to Atonement, I mentioned this, how Girard changes the debate, doesn't mention Buddhism, the religions at all. 2022, their cross problem in ours, doesn't mention religions at all. 2026 is a very interesting book, which is all about suffering and all about people in pain, theology and medicine and conversation. The cross is certainly talked about, atonement is, and it's not without reference to Buddhism, but it's also a book in which it's not about Buddhism. It's not about working with Buddhist patients or Hindu patients. It's not about their theology and ours, but it's rather if you are in fact grounded in the cross, if you understand what atonement is and isn't, then you begin to realize that people, historically figures, contemporary figures who are in deep suffering, what can you bring, being aware of kind of the resonances and echoes with what Buddhists bring or Hindus bring or others. And not kind of saying, I've now comprehended the whole thing, but a book that's about something else. So engaging, the so-called secular world, courses on theology and science, now working with medicine, which doesn't kind of is not beholden to Christian faith or Buddhist faith, to realize that in some way, all I have learned all these years helps me to be in dialogue with a medical person, a medical doctor. And that, I think, is so important. to conclude, I would just say several more things. So I think all of this is quite wonderful, but we shouldn't undersell Mark by seeing it's a really glorious career, it's really all fits together. Let's thank Mark and move on. Because Mark raises so many questions for us and kind of provokes us if we actually pay attention to what he's saying. And I think that's the sign of a real intellectual, the ability to be thinking when you're young, when you're middle-aged, when you're old, to keep thinking and not being afraid that what you learn may in fact disrupt what you knew yesterday or knew 10 years ago. And while Mark is still, I've never seen any evidence in his work, not a committed Christian, he is a committed Christian. In some sense, the cross is still the center of Mark's life and work. Nonetheless, the disruptions continue. And maybe in a Girardian sense, the cross disrupts everything. It also pushes you into the interreligious realm, but it also disrupts you at the same time. And I think that's glorious. Back to Douglas Clyde McIntosh, and then one more quote, and then afterward, and then I will sit down. Back in that 1984 essay, which everyone should read, The Path of a Liberal Theologian, again, what Mark quotes Barth saying that applies to McIntosh, I think now we can see with a fuller sense, applies to Mark himself. Those of us who knew people like Mark, I'm changing it, will know what I mean when they say that from this person has emanated an unforgettable air of conscientiousness, of churchly and spontaneous piety, a peculiar combination of ethical earnestness and academic dignity. And that's Mark Heim, too. It may be what Barth was looking for, it may be what McIntosh is about, and it's what Mark shows us. And then a quote from a figure I barely mentioned, George Peck, who was the president of Andover Newton in those days when I was new there and sadly died young. In several places, Mark refers to George Peck's powerful effect on his life, his real theological mentor, Peck, who had lived in other parts of the world, lived in India, Pakistan maybe, lived in other contexts and thought about it. But that Peck, Mark writes, unlike Merton, who had gravitated toward Barth as a Catholic, Peck had come from a conservative Baptist background and gravitated to Barth over the suspicious objections of conservative intellectuals. His love for Barth grew hand in hand with his firsthand appreciation for Hinduism. He found in Barth a theological prescription for a wholehearted Christian commitment and exuberantly open mind for other faiths. Now, when one thinks of Barth, one doesn't think of an exuberantly open mind to other faiths, but I think Mark, like George Peck, found there something that pushes us out without fear. And then Mark goes on to say, one offhand but vivid sentence sums up Peck's view. Because I am committed to Christ, I am open to other religions. In some sense, I could have just said that at the beginning and sat down, that's a key word for Mark, but because I am committed to Christ, I am open to other religions. And the nature of that is a mantra, a koan, a deep Christian faith, somehow speaks about what Mark has been up to all these years. But the thing I'd like to close with, a more personal reflection, is to say that Mark didn't do all this on his own. He had many, many colleagues, many, many students, but he also had Melissa. And I think if you think about Mark is always with Melissa always with Mark. They're pilgrims on the road together. Back to some of Melissa's early work on women missionaries in India and the transition from the foreign missionaries to the indigenous missionaries. Also pushing the boundaries and thinking about the church in other parts of the world and the wins and losses of crossing over from the colonial to the post-colonial period. I think that's a great grace that somehow you see evident in Mark's work, although the name Melissa Heim rarely comes up in the work. Nonetheless, that this couldn't have happened without the two of you together. And so I think as we celebrate Mark tonight, we have to celebrate also Melissa, because you are a couple and you belong together, and in you both, all of this has been possible. Thank you all.
Now it is. All right, so my name is Cornille, and it's a great honor to be here with you and to respond to Frank's wonderful overview of Mark's life and career. In many ways, everything was said, so how do we respond to such a comprehensive overview of what Mark has contributed to various fields? But in the short time that I have, I want to just lift up a few elements, maybe that will serve as an emphasis more than as anything new, but things that I found very important in Mark's work and that I want to present here. First, I want to say something, though. I just finished editing a book, Sacred Encounter Stories of Christian Pioneers of Interreligious Dialogue. And when I asked Mark if he would contribute to the book, he said, well, I don't know if my life is anything interesting or unusual or extraordinary. And so, but now that we've heard Frank, I think we know very well that his life is anything but common or unusual. And that, you know, from being the son of a Baptist pastor in Vermont to becoming one of the most influential and important theologians of the past 50 years, I think is anything but common or unpredictable. So I want to just start with that comment. So Frank has made it clear, I think, that Mark's work has represented a very important and essential contribution to two fields of study, theology of religions and comparative theology. But what I find particularly remarkable is that in Mark's work, we see that those two fields are intimately intertwined and inseparable. And there's been a long debate in comparative theology and theology of religions whether one needs the other or not. But I think Mark has never sort of made a lot of fuss about it or made a strong stand in this whole debate, but just in his quiet way, he has shown how these two fields are intimately intertwined and need each other, and he has, you know, done important work in both of those fields. And I think all of this is beautifully summarized in the quote that Frank ended with, also by George Peck, because I am committed to Christ, I am open to other religions. And in this story that Mark tells in this volume of Sacred Encounters, he says that maybe his whole life has been an unpacking of that expression. Because I'm committed to Christ, I am open to other religions. So since we are here at Yale, I thought it was appropriate maybe to say something about the connection between Mark's work and this other important, illustrious theologian here at Yale, George Lindbeck. So Mark doesn't really refer very often to George Lindbeck in his own work, but I have been struck by the remarkable continuities and commonalities between Mark's work and Lindbeck's work, but also by the fact that Mark has really taken Lindbeck's ideas and carried them further than Lindbeck ever did. And I just want to point to a few areas in which I think this is the case. So first of all, I think Mark's attention to the alterity of other religions and to the internal integrity of each religious tradition is something that was also very central to Lindbeck's idea of truth as being an element of the internal grammar of religious traditions. And this is something that also in Mark's work you see very evidently, that he doesn't reduce other religious traditions to Christianity or interpret them purely from a Christian perspective, but he tries to go as far as possible, is how he puts it always, as far as possible in entering into the self-understanding of the other religion. So that's been a constant in his work. In Salvations, it comes out very clearly in the way he emphasizes the intimate connection between practice and realization, or between religious practice and the ends towards which these practices are oriented. So we can't just reduce the ends of other religions to our own ends. They each have their own integrity and their own value, and we have to go as far as possible in the self-understanding of other religious traditions. So that's really been, I think, a really important constant in his work. But unlike Lindbeck, and I think Lindbeck has been misunderstood in the idea that other religions are impenetrable or unintelligible, I think Mark has, as we heard before, has really made a tremendous effort in trying to understand other religions and penetrating into their self-understanding. And it's not been only a matter of theoretical study of text for Mark. He's really gone and practiced with other religious traditions and tried to experience those other traditions from within. So maybe I don't want to, I have a short amount of time, but at the end of his story in my volume, he tells me, or he tells the audience, the readers, what after a whole lifetime of study of Buddhism he has learned from Buddhism. And I think it's worthwhile sort of reading this if you don't mind. The aspect of Buddhism I have been exploring that I most long to incorporate in my own Christianity is a particular quality of emptiness and compassion. Buddhist no-self and the Christian creaturely self converge in agreement that there is no self-sufficient ontological essence to be found in ourselves. Such a supported thing is not real. Christians quickly move beyond this recognition, if they think to make it, to look toward the relational and communal self that is both real and love-worthy. I believe there is great benefit in relaxing into, in purposefully inhabiting this emptiness. For Christians like me, that habitation remains a visitation and not an absolute condition. But its cultivation under Buddhist instruction short-circuits an immense portion of suffering rooted in projection. The cultivation enables access to an equidistant equanimity, compassion towards the suffering of all beings. That seems crucial to love in the long term or the largest social scale. Neither Stoic asceticism nor moral indifference, this is a precious gift to Christian practice as much as Christian thought. So this is what Mark says he has taken from Buddhism. But as we heard, he has always remained firmly grounded in the Christian tradition. And his theology of religions, I think, gives evidence of his continued attempt to understand the meaning of Christ and of the Trinity, of the Christian understanding of God in relation to other religious traditions. And this is where I think also in The Depth of the Riches, he goes beyond Lindbeck. So Lindbeck believed that the ultimate ends of different religions are incompatible in their claims to ultimacy. But he also says in The Nature of Doctrine that the religion that is most capable of absorbing the ends of other religions without losing itself is the winner. That's the language that he uses. And that's really what Mark has done. In The Depth of the Riches, he has shown how capacious Christian understanding of the Trinity is and how it's capable of really absorbing the ends of other religions within itself. So Mark doesn't sort of gloat in this reality or declare that Christianity is the winner, but this kind of idea, I think, has opened the door for a very long and very fruitful dialogue with people like my former colleague at Boston College, John McCransky, and it's been a long and very important spiritual and personal friendship, I think, between the two. So I will end by just pointing to two personal qualities that I have found always very inspiring about Mark. And the first one, it was already mentioned, is his incredible freedom and initiative in engaging any source that would be able to enrich Christian self-understanding, whether it's science or philosophy or the study of other religions. Mark has always been open to engaging all these sources of inspiration and insight in order to enrich the Christian tradition. And I think that that's a really important lesson for all of us and for so many theologians and students who focus on learning more and more about less and less. I think Mark is precisely the opposite, learning more and more about more and more things. So that's, I think, one of the really admirable elements of Mark's career. And the second element is the fact that in spite of all this engagement with all these, or because maybe of this engagement with all these different sources, Mark has never belonged to a camp. So he's always remained open to anything that could be interesting or inspiring without either declaring himself a classical, confessional, comparative theologian or refusing to engage in theology without walls, which I have designated as a kind of meta-confessional comparative theology. He goes freely back and forth between the two without sort of fear or without sort of need to identify with a particular camp. He has engaged Girard in a very constructive way without being a Girardian. He's usually regarded as an inclusivist, but he's also moved in the area of religious hybridity. So this is something, I think, that reflects his theological authenticity, openness, integrity also, and that I've always really admired, Mark. So, Mark, thank you for your kindness, for your generosity, and for your generative theological thought that will be a source for my own thinking and for many coming generations of comparative and other theologians. Thank you.
Going last is a tricky proposition after these two. I want to begin with a word of thanks. As I met Mark and Frank as a student at Boston University, and then I took classes with them. Well, I don't know if I ever formally took a class with Mark. That I'll have to sort through my records to see, but Frank tried to teach me Sanskrit with mixed results. So it's a daunting proposition to speak after my former teacher, and then of course the Boston theological community of folks doing comparative theology through the BTI. Well, these two were the pioneers of that entire enterprise. So my formative years were very much in their care, but that doesn't mean they should be blamed for what I will now say. They might regret it, but they're not responsible. Many of you gathered here will recall Albert Schweitzer's famous assertion that the quest for the historical Jesus is like looking down a well. Every generation finds its own reflection. Those who are vaguely aware of this quotation may think of the assertion as dismissive of such efforts, but far from it. Actually, when one reads Schweitzer, he actually said, thus each successive epoch of theology found its own thoughts in Jesus. That was indeed the only way in which it could make him live. But it was not only each epoch that found its reflection in Jesus, each individual created him in accordance with his own character. There is no historical task which so reveals a man's true self as the writing of a life of Jesus. It may be the case that writing a theological life of Mark, Heim, is a comparable enterprise. Each of us finds ourselves reflected in the life of our oceanic friend. But in the case of Mark, that is because Mark has genuinely shaped each of us in such profound ways that we do find ourselves in him. And we do so because it's partly Mark's doing. Frank sees much of himself in Mark, and rightly so. But not quite the same Mark. and it'll be interesting to compare our marks as they emerge in our remarks. As usual, Frank's own careful, faithful, and encyclopedic scholarship about Mark is characteristically Clooney, a labor of heart as well as of mind, indeed of a heart as capacious as his formidable mind. Like the kingdom, the time is surely at hand, and now is, for any number of productive dissertations to be written about Mark Heim. And I don't imagine that anyone who would dare to venture such a project could begin otherwise than by reading Frank's keen reading of Mark. I would not be surprised to hear Mark confess that Frank discovers aspects of Mark's work that he himself had not fully thematized. That's just the way of Frank. But I come not to rhapsodize Frank, but rather to praise Mark. I am constrained by far less time, but also incapacity to be as capacious and careful a scholar as Frank is, so my remarks will be somewhat more focused. I regard Mark as my closest kin in the fields of theologies of religious diversity and comparative theology. And lest that remark seem immodest, let me clarify at once what I mean. I refer just to a few features of Mark's temperament and thought that were not as prominently featured in Frank's lucid appreciation, hence my construction of Mark. First, Mark's deep confessional Christian commitments, as Frank notes, far from closing him down to other religious traditions, lead him instead to be open more deeply and even existentially to them. I scoured Mark's writings, not to Frank's extent, but a good bit, and I did not find that he has characterized himself anywhere as a multiple religious belonger, or even named himself as a multiple religious participant. Though, of course, when you read what he actually does as a dedicated practitioner of Nyingma Buddhist disciplines under the guidance of a Lama John McCransky, he would certainly qualify to make such a claim. But Mark, I think, is quite deliberate about not venturing such a claim. His is a deep openness that is at once wedded to his strong confessional and specifically evangelical roots. But his openness to being formed by the religious practices of others, that is a point of strong resonance between the two of us. I mean, I myself have also studied with John McCransky. I argue that to truly see as the other sees, one must practice as the other practices. Not in every respect, but at least in some. I think this is a sentiment that Mark and I share. So in this respect, I think we're profoundly fellow travelers. Another area I think we're kindred spirits in is that he has a deep sympathy and openness for folks who do not follow neat religious itineraries. He is a sympathetic critic of those among us who have embraced the Theology Without Walls project. A critic, but he's also a sympathetic ally of younger colleagues and students who do not identify with a single tradition as the ground of their theological thinking. I find that utterly lovely, and I experienced that firsthand when all three of us led these summer seminars through the AAR on theologies of religious pluralism and comparative theology. Mark was just a keen listener to people who just wanted to argue with Frank at all moments about this model of comparative theology that has to have a home ground, and then a crossing over, and then a return. Many of the younger voices just said, I don't have such a home ground, or I'm multiple to begin with. And I think Mark had a singular capacity to hear those voices and to try to figure out what it was about their religious lives that he could both appreciate, resonate with, and to some extent support, with, of course, some measure of critical reservations. Another area in which I'm profoundly dedicated, besides the one I just named, is the one that Catherine so beautifully talked about. One of the two disciplines in which Mark and I largely work, that is, theologies of religious diversity, fell into a real crisis of confidence, thanks to comparative theologians. I only partly blame Frank. He wasn't as responsible as his friend and colleague James Fredericks, who, as a comparative theologian, insisted that theology of religious pluralism must be put on a moratorium. You guys ought to knock it off, is basically what James Frederick argued. He said that this project that both Mark and I are committed to is not really doable, that every extant option available within the field is problematic, and we should just do comparative theology and leave aside the project of theologies of religious diversity. Don't try to generate a full account as a Christian about what religious diversity as such means. And Frank, I think, was perhaps sympathetic to Fredericks, but I don't know that he altogether accepted this call for a moratorium. Mark, on the other hand, explicitly did not. And if we had all listened to Mark earlier, I don't think that that particular field would have lingered in a kind of crisis. His arguments still carry the day, in my estimation. Mark argues that we all have implicit theologies of religious diversity, and we would be better if we made them explicit. Then, speaking to this other kind of deep openness and sensitivity to the religious lives of people who don't follow clean itineraries, he noted that for many double belongers and the like, or the spiritual but not religious, their religious lives are often rooted in their theologies of religious diversity. That's just often their core theological orientation. So why dismiss such a project? How could you? Again, a kind of deep sensitivity to the religious lives of these folks. And I'm on the cusp, though I'm not quite as ambiguous as most are. I mean, I happen to be an Anglican priest, so. But most importantly, Mark argued that theologies of religious diversity can serve as what he calls a docking mechanism, a site within Christian theology for receiving the wisdom garnered through the work of comparative theology. That, to me, is a fundamental insight in this field that I think require at least a dissertation or two. It's a massive contribution that he makes. And it's the clearest articulation of why theologies of religious diversity and comparative theology need each other. There needs to be a place within the Christian community for theological reflection that receives wisdom from other traditions. And for Mark and I both, that site is Trinitarian theology of religious diversity. Rethinking our notions of Trinity by learning with and from, and even as Buddhists or Hindus, is how to go about refreshing our theologies of religious diversity and thereby also refreshing our own tradition. So there's this lovely sense in Mark's work of the Christian tradition as an unfolding journey. That even if he's rooted at home within Christianity, it's not a fixed, rigid, unchanging, pristine, finished Christianity of some discernible historical moment, but instead a Christianity that the theologian means to carry forward, even as the theologian is indebted to that tradition that he is contributing to reshaping and refashioning. So for all these remarkable gifts, we owe Mark, and generations to come owe Mark tremendous thanks. But I think my relation to Mark will be largely remembered by those who do remember such things, because I was the first person to get Mark to do karaoke. He and I sang the Beatles together, and if I had thought to tell Dean Sterling, we could have had a little machine set up for us at your later events so that we could sing and celebrate you properly with a theological duet, but perhaps an occasion for that sort will still remain. So thank you.
The first and the last time, John. So I'm charged to close our time here with a brief benediction, but before I do that, I have to say at least a brief word of thanks to the three colleagues who have graced and not quite lied, but glossed my life in a way that is gratifying. No one influenced my work in this area or my career generally than Frank, and I could give chapter and verse about that, but to put it simply, I had a theological intuition about something that ought to be true, and Frank was the embodiment of that reality. I didn't know it was actual until I saw it happen in Frank. With John, it's a case of a certain number of common ideas that sort of made deep sense to both of us, and to have the pleasure and the joy of seeing those ideas unfold in slightly different ways, but in conversation and in application over many years, that's also a unique and profoundly satisfying experience in my career. And Catherine and I certainly have been influenced by Catherine's work in this area, her own writing about Hinduism and comparative theology, and the comparative theology field itself is described best by Catherine in her work about it. But I also feel a special debt to you. I think you share something that John has, but I see it embodied in you so extremely, this ability to orchestrate the gifts of others, and whether it's in a narrow field or in a wider connection, to bring comparative theology and discussion with theology in a wider sense, and to bring people together for events in which they flourish and gain, but only because someone took the time and the energy to make it happen. And I've been the beneficiary of that so many times. So I could say much more about all of these colleagues, but I thank them for their generous assessments. So please join with me in a brief word of prayer. Holy One, bless and release us from this place with thanks for those who have spoken, with joy in the work of scholarship and teaching, the study in the classroom, those watchful, tender spaces where we kindle your light, startle thoughts to life, open eyes and quicken hearts. Bless the sacred room for searching, the joy in what we may yet know, and make us thankful for our callings. You who make and wake, raise and save. Receive my words, these thanks, our praise. Amen.